1974, Miami, the man who restored the Cuban mansion and awakened the five spirits who never left. In the heart of Little Haiti, Miami, there exists a mansion that neighbors avoid looking at directly. Not because of its deteriorated neoclassical architecture, nor because of the broken windows that reflect the Florida sun like empty eyes. They avoid it because, as they whisper on street corners, Villa Paula never truly became empty after its last official inhabitants abandoned it. 1974. The year when Cliff Ensor signed the purchase papers for $33,000 before a Department of Housing and Urban Development official who seemed relieved to get rid of the problem. The mansion had been attracting vagrants, vandals, and the curious for years. County authorities had already issued the demolition order. They only needed to set the date. But Cliff saw something different when he crossed the threshold that first time. He saw 18-foot-high ceilings, Tuscan columns imported from Cuba, hand-painted tiles that still retained their colors under decades of dust and neglect. He saw a masterpiece from 1926 waiting to be rescued. He didn't see the other thing. The mansion had been built by the Cuban government as a consulate and residence for Don Domingo Milord and his wife Paula. The Havana architect Cayetano Frera had designed every detail. 10 rooms distributed with mathematical elegance, 2 bathrooms with bronze fixtures, leaded windows that projected rainbows of colors onto the marble floor when the sun pierced through their glass. Every brick, every nail, every wooden plank had traveled from Cuba on ships that crossed the Florida Straits. Even the workers who raised its walls were Cuban, men who sang boleros while mixing cement under the relentless sun of a Miami that was then little more than an agricultural town called Lemon City. Domingo and Paula Milord moved in during 1927. Both were around 50 years old. He, the son of a cigar manufacturer, had served as Spanish vice consul in Key West before assuming his Cuban position. She, born in Cuba, was an opera singer. Her voice, neighbors from that era said, could be heard floating through the afternoons when she practiced at the piano Domingo had bought her. She especially liked to perform arias from Carmen. She liked to close the bedroom door to prevent drafts from brushing her shoulders while she played. She liked the aroma of freshly ground Colombian coffee that she prepared every morning in the mansion's kitchen. She liked to place fresh bouquets of roses in the dining room, even out of season. 4 years after moving in, the Milords abandoned Villa Paula. It was 1930. Political turmoil in Cuba and a devastating economic depression had forced the consulate's closure. The mansion ceased to serve in any official capacity for the Cuban government. Domingo and Paula moved to another address in Miami, first to 1552 Northeast Miami Court, then to 59 Northeast 11th Terrace. 2 years later, in August 1932, Paula entered Jackson Memorial Hospital. Doctors amputated her leg, trying to stop the complications consuming her. It didn't work. At 61 years old, Paula Milord died in a hospital bed, far from the mansion that bore her name carved in stucco letters above the main entrance. Domingo never returned to Villa Paula. 5 years after Paula's death, in November 1937, Domingo also died. They buried him in Key West Cemetery, in a grave without a headstone, without a location number in the records. A pauper's grave, though he hadn't been poor. Helen Reardon, a wealthy widow from Wisconsin, purchased Villa Paula after the Milords' departure. She lived there with her 2 daughters for 4 decades, until her death in 1970. Neighbors from that era remember her as a reserved woman who kept the mansion impeccable, though she never mentioned anything unusual. When her daughters sold the property after her passing, the mansion began its descent. For 4 years, Villa Paula changed hands repeatedly. It functioned briefly as a senior citizen's residence. Then it stood empty. The neighborhood around it deteriorated. Gangs marked its white walls with graffiti. Vandals shot at the beautiful leaded windows, destroying them glass by glass. Drug addicts and vagrants found shelter in its abandoned rooms. By 1974, Villa Paula was officially a public hazard condemned to demolition. Then Cliff Ensor appeared. He was 81 years old when decades later he would speak by phone from North Carolina, his voice still firm, still convinced, the house is definitely haunted. But that afternoon in 1974, as Cliff walked through the empty rooms calculating how much repairs would cost, as he took measurements and made notes in his pad, as he imagined how he would restore the mansion to its original glory, he heard nothing strange. The first knock on the main door wouldn't arrive until several days after moving in. A firm, decisive knock. The kind of knock someone makes when they expect to be answered. When Cliff opened the door, no one was there. Cliff Ensor was not a man who frightened easily. He had bought and restored properties before. He knew that old houses made noises. Pipes groaned, wood creaked, Air currents could create sounds that seemed like footsteps or voices. There were rational explanations for everything. He invested thousands of dollars in the restoration. He hired carpenters to repair the destroyed window frames. He called specialized artisans to replace the leaded glass, seeking to replicate the original colors that Cayetano Freire had specified in 1926. He personally sanded the wooden floors, discovering beneath layers of grime the hand-painted tiles that no one had appreciated in years. The mansion began to awaken under his hands. Week after week, the rooms recovered their dignity. The 18-foot ceilings became impeccably white again. The Tuscan columns were cleaned until they revealed the veins of marble imported from Cuba. Cliff installed new lamps, repaired the plumbing, renovated the electrical system. Every detail received his meticulous attention. During the first months, he worked from dawn until nightfall. Sometimes he fell asleep on an improvised mattress in one of the second-floor rooms, too tired to drive to his other residence. The mansion enveloped him in its silence. A silence he found peaceful after the noise of tools and construction dust. But the silence wasn't complete. The knocks on the main door continued. Not every day. Not at predictable times. Sometimes weeks passed without anything, and Cliff almost forgot the first incident. Then, when he least expected it, while he was sanding a window frame or painting a wall, he would hear that sound. Knock, knock, knock. Always 3 knocks. Always firm. Always followed by nothing when he opened the door. Cliff began to joke about it with the workers he hired. "My ghost visitor came again," he would say with a smile as he wiped dust from his hands. The workers laughed nervously. Some stopped coming without giving explanations. An elderly neighbor, a Haitian woman who had lived in the house next door since before the Milords left, approached one day while Cliff worked in the front yard. "Have you closed the master bedroom door?" she asked without preamble. Cliff straightened, confused. "Excuse me?" "The bedroom door where the piano was. Paula always closed it. She didn't like drafts on her shoulders when she played." The old woman pointed toward a second-floor window. Then she walked away without saying more, moving quickly as if she had fulfilled an uncomfortable obligation. Cliff went up that night to the master bedroom. Indeed, there were marks on the floor indicating where a piano had been. The indentations were deep, left by years of concentrated weight. He wondered how many hours Paula had spent there, playing her favorite arias, closing the door against the drafts. He decided to install his own room in another chamber. Months passed. The restoration advanced. Cliff began to spend more time at Villa Paula, inhabiting it instead of simply working on it. He bought furniture that complemented the neoclassical architecture. He hung paintings. He placed plants in terracotta pots in the backyard, near where he discovered a strange concrete structure, a kind of sarcophagus with an embedded turquoise cross, covered by the roots of a fig tree that had grown wild during years of abandonment. The structure intrigued him. It looked like a tomb, but whose? Neighbors told him the legend. Domingo had buried Paula there after her death, to keep her close, just outside the window of the bedroom they had shared. Cliff investigated. He found no records that it was legal to bury someone in a private residence's backyard. Moreover, Paula had died in the hospital 2 years after moving out of Villa Paula. The story didn't add up, but the structure was there, undeniable, mysterious. He adopted 3 cats. He liked animals, and the mansion had mice after years of abandonment. The cats adapted quickly, exploring every corner, chasing shadows through the long hallways. It was then that Cliff began to notice other details. The aroma. Some mornings, when coming down to the kitchen, he smelled freshly brewed coffee. Strong coffee, the kind prepared in aluminum Cuban coffee makers, that unmistakable smell that fills an entire house. But his coffee maker was off. Cold. And used. At first he thought the smell came from a neighbor's house, transported by the wind. But the aroma was too intense, too present, as if someone had just finished grinding the beans in Villa Paula's kitchen. Other times, usually in the afternoons, he smelled roses in the dining room. A sweet and penetrating perfume that had no visible source. Cliff had no roses. There were no rose bushes in the garden. It was the wrong time of year for them to bloom naturally in Miami. Yet there was the aroma floating through the dining room as if someone had placed an invisible vase on the table. Cliff was a practical man. He looked for explanations. He checked if there were old air fresheners hidden somewhere, cleaning products with floral fragrances, anything that could justify the smells. He found nothing. One night, while reading in the living room, he heard music. It wasn't music from the radio or from some neighbor. It was a piano. The notes were clear, melodious, played with the confidence of someone who knows the piece from memory. He vaguely recognized the melody, something operatic, possibly from Carmen. He got up and followed the sound. It led him to the second floor, to the hallway toward the master bedroom. The door was closed. Cliff put his hand on the doorknob. The music stopped instantly. He opened the door. The room was empty, illuminated only by moonlight entering through the window. There was no piano. There was nothing that could produce music. The silence was absolute. He stood in the doorway, feeling his accelerated pulse gradually calm. "I must be more tired than I thought," he told himself. He closed the door and went back downstairs. That night, before falling asleep, he heard footsteps. They weren't normal footsteps. They were the distinctive click of high heels against stone. They came from the backyard, from the flagstone path that led from the house to the root-covered sarcophagus. Click, click, click. Rhythmic. Decisive. The kind of footsteps a woman makes when walking with purpose, with elegance, with the confidence of someone who knows every inch of the place. Cliff looked out the window. The patio was empty under the light from street lamps. The footsteps continued for a few more seconds, then faded away. He didn't sleep well that night. But the next morning, under the Florida sunlight, everything seemed absurd again. Old houses. Normal noises. Rational explanations. Cliff continued with the restoration. He didn't know that the small details he was ignoring would soon explode into something he couldn't rationalize. The master bedroom door began to close by itself. It wasn't a dramatic slam. It wasn't the kind of bang that wind makes when it rushes through a house with open windows. It was a deliberate closing, soft, the kind of movement someone makes who doesn't want to disturb but needs privacy. Cliff first noticed it on a June afternoon in 1975. He had left all the second-floor doors open so air could circulate. The air conditioning system was old and didn't cool uniformly. He needed cross-ventilation. He went upstairs for a tool he had forgotten and found the master bedroom door completely closed. The other rooms remained open. There was no air current. None of the windows in that room were open. Paula always closed it, he remembered the elderly neighbor's words. She didn't like drafts on her shoulders when she played. He opened the door and left it that way. The next day it was closed again. It began happening regularly. Every time Cliff left that door open, eventually he found it closed. Sometimes hours passed. Sometimes only minutes. He never heard it closing. He simply discovered that it had happened. He stopped opening it. The cats began behaving strangely. The youngest, a tabby cat that Cliff had named Spots, refused to enter the dining room. He would stop at the threshold, hair bristled, tail puffed, eyes fixed on something Cliff couldn't see. Then he would run away as if being chased. The other two cats avoided the backyard near the sarcophagus. They arched their backs and hissed when Cliff tried to bring them there. One July morning, Cliff came down for breakfast and found his kitchen destroyed. He hadn't heard anything during the night. He had slept deeply, exhausted after a full day of sanding and varnishing. But when he entered the kitchen, dishes and glasses lay broken on the tile floor. Silverware was scattered everywhere, as if someone had violently swept them from the drawers. The door of one of the cabinets hung from a single hinge. There were no signs of forced entry. The windows were closed from inside. The main doors secured. Cliff knelt among the porcelain fragments, picking up pieces, trying to understand what had happened. An earthquake? There were no earthquakes in Florida. The cats? Impossible. Cats couldn't open drawers or tear doors from their hinges. He cleaned everything. He bought new dishes. He didn't tell anyone. A week later, he was sitting on the front porch enjoying the sunset when he heard a metallic creak above his head. He looked up just in time to see the porch chandelier detach from its base. The wrought iron chandelier, which weighed at least 44 pounds, fell and crashed onto the concrete floor less than 3 feet from where Cliff was sitting. The crash echoed throughout the entire street. Neighbors came out of their houses to see what had happened. Cliff examined the base where the chandelier had been mounted. The screws were still there, intact, firmly screwed into the wooden ceiling. There were no signs of corrosion or deterioration. The chandelier had simply detached, as if someone had lifted it out of its mounting. Pure old metal, he told the neighbors who had approached with concern. I need to check all the fixtures. But when everyone left and Cliff stood alone looking at the shattered chandelier on the ground, he felt for the first time something he hadn't felt since buying Villa Paula. Genuine fear. If he had been standing 2 feet to the left, the chandelier would have fallen on him. The smells intensified. They were no longer subtle, occasional fragrances. The aroma of Cuban coffee filled the kitchen almost every morning, so strong that Cliff could almost taste the bitterness on his tongue. The rose perfume in the dining room became overwhelming some afternoons, cloying, as if there were dozens of bouquets decomposing in a closed space. And the music. The piano music now sounded several times a week. Always the same operatic melody. Always coming from the master bedroom. Always ceasing the instant Cliff approached the door. One August night he decided not to approach. He stayed in the second-floor hallway several yards from the closed door and simply listened. The music continued for almost 10 minutes. It was beautiful, executed with technique and passion. Cliff closed his eyes and let the notes envelop him. When he opened his eyes, he saw something in his peripheral vision. A shadow. A human form moving at the end of the hallway. He turned his head sharply, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. But he had seen something, he was certain. A dark silhouette, diffuse at the edges, which had vanished the moment he tried to focus on it directly. The piano music stopped. Cliff remained motionless, his heart pounding hard in his chest, waiting. The silence that followed was dense, expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Nothing else happened that night. But the next day, while working in the front yard, Cliff heard a scream from the backyard. It was one of his cats, Spots the tabby. He ran toward the sound and found a scene that froze him. The iron gate of the backyard, a heavy gate that required considerable force to move, was crushing the cat against the ground. There was no wind. The gate had been completely open, secured against the wall with a metal hook. Cliff lifted the gate. The cat was dead, its neck broken. There was no way the gate had closed by itself. The hook had to be released manually. Someone or something had released the hook, had pushed the gate, had waited for the exact moment when the cat passed underneath. Cliff buried the cat under a tree in the corner of the yard. He didn't adopt another. He began to wonder if he was making a terrible mistake by staying at Villa Paula. But he had invested so much money, so much time, so much effort. The mansion was almost completely restored. It was beautiful. It was his masterpiece. He couldn't simply abandon it over strange noises and unfortunate coincidences. He decided to seek answers another way. A friend told him about a woman named Emma Tandrick, a reverend from the Holy Spiritual Church of God in Opelika. Emma was a medium. She conducted seances. She had a reputation for being genuine, not a charlatan looking for easy money. Cliff contacted her in September 1975. Emma came to Villa Paula on a Friday afternoon. She was a middle-aged woman, dressed simply, without the theatrics Cliff had expected from a medium. She didn't bring special candles or mystical instruments. Only her calm presence and a small notebook. She walked through the mansion in silence for almost an hour, stopping occasionally, tilting her head as if listening to something Cliff couldn't perceive. She didn't ask questions. She didn't request any story or context. When she finished her tour, she sat with Cliff in the living room and opened her notebook. "There are 5, she said simply. "5 what?" Cliff asked. "5 spirits in this house." Emma began to describe what she had perceived. There was a female presence who was shy, who didn't want to identify herself directly but who loved Colombian coffee, who adored playing music from Carmen on the piano, who enjoyed placing roses throughout the house. This presence wasn't malicious. She just wanted to be allowed to continue with her routines. There was a thin man with a top hat. He walked through the second floor, checking rooms as if he were still fulfilling some official duty. There was a heavy-set woman dressed in red. This presence was more aggressive. She didn't like intruders. She was responsible for objects that moved, for doors that slammed forcefully. There was a woman crying in the backyard, searching for something she had lost. A medal. Something of sentimental value she couldn't find. And there was a very sad young woman, searching for the grave of her illegitimate baby. She walked the grounds of Villa Paula without rest, unable to find peace. "The one who doesn't want to identify herself," Cliff said slowly. "Is it Paula? Paula Milord?" Emma closed her notebook. She didn't say her name, but she mentioned that she doesn't like cats in her house. Cliff felt a chill run down his back. Emma agreed to perform a formal seance. Cliff invited several friends, people he knew who wouldn't mock, who would take the process seriously. The session was scheduled for late October 1975. Meanwhile, the phenomena continued. But now Cliff saw them with different eyes. They were no longer random, incomprehensible events. They had origin. They had purpose. He didn't know if that made things better or infinitely worse. The night before the seance, Cliff had his most direct encounter up to that moment. He was walking through the second-floor hallway heading to the bathroom when he saw her. It wasn't something caught from the corner of his eye. It wasn't a diffuse shadow. It was a complete, clear vision, impossible to misinterpret. A Cuban woman with black hair pulled back in a tight bun, dressed in a long dress to her ankles, floating through the hallway without touching the floor. She was smiling, moving with grace as if dancing to music only she could hear. She had only one leg. She glided through the hallway, passed within inches of Cliff without looking at him, and gradually vanished into the air like dispersing smoke. Cliff remained paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe, until his brain finally processed what he had seen and his legs recovered the ability to support him. He went down the stairs stumbling, left Villa Paula, sat in his car in the driveway and waited for dawn. When the sun finally rose over Little Haiti, illuminating the white walls of the mansion, Cliff made a decision. He wouldn't leave. He wouldn't abandon Villa Paula. But he needed to understand what he was sharing his home with. The seance couldn't come soon enough. The seance on October 28, 1975 began at 8 in the evening. Emma Tandrick arrived with 2 assistants from her church. Cliff had invited 6 more people. Close friends, a University of Miami professor interested in paranormal phenomena, and a couple of neighbors who had lived in Little Haiti since the 40s and remembered when Villa Paula was the Cuban consulate. They sat around the dining room table. Emma had brought candles, but insisted they weren't for creating atmosphere but to provide soft light that wouldn't interfere with the energies. She placed a cassette recorder in the center of the table. For documentation, she explained. I want everyone to hold hands, Emma said. Keep your minds open but calm. Don't be afraid. Spirits respond to fear with agitation. They closed their eyes. Emma began to speak in a low voice, inviting any presence in the house to communicate, promising respect and understanding. During the first minutes, nothing happened. Only the sound of participants breathing, the distant hum of traffic on the avenue, the occasional creak of the old mansion's wood settling. Then Emma began to change. Her breathing became deeper, slower. Her head tilted back slightly. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, softer, with a slight accent that hadn't been there before. I like to grind the coffee, said the voice coming from Emma. Colombian coffee. The aroma fills the entire house. It's my morning ritual. Cliff felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. I like to play the piano, the voice continued. Carmen is my favorite. Bizet understood it. He understood passion, fire. I close the door when I play. Drafts bother me on my shoulders. What's your name? Emma asked with her own voice, alternating between being the medium and the channel. Silence. Don't be afraid to tell us your name. The roses, the voice said evasively. They must be fresh. Always fresh in the dining room. Domingo brings me roses. He's attentive. He loves me. He named the house in my honor. One of Emma's assistants whispered, It's her. It's Paula Milord. The session continued for almost 2 hours. The entity speaking through Emma never explicitly confirmed being Paula, but the details were unmistakable. She described life at Villa Paula during the 20s, when Miami was small, when the house was new and beautiful, when there were parties with Cuban diplomats and piano music floating through the evenings. She described the sadness of having to leave in 1930, when political problems in Cuba forced the consulate's closure. She described something else, something about pain in her leg, about doctors who couldn't help, but she became confused and distressed when she tried to explain more. I don't like to remember the hospital, the voice said, now tense. I don't like to remember the end. Emma allowed the presence to withdraw. There was a moment of silence, then Emma seemed to connect with another energy. This time her voice became deeper, more authoritative. She described a tall, thin man, formally dressed, walking through the upper rooms, verifying that everything was in order. Consular responsibilities, the voice murmured. I must make sure everything is correct. Cuba depends on me. Then came another presence, and this one was different. Emma began to become agitated in her chair. Her voice became harsh, almost growling. Out. This is my house. Everyone out. It was the heavy-set woman dressed in red, the aggressive presence. Through Emma, she demanded that everyone abandon Villa Paula. She screamed that the house had been desecrated, that strangers had no right to be there. She was terrifying in her fury. Emma's assistants had to intervene, guiding her to break the connection with that particular entity. Emma gasped, regaining control of herself, sweating profusely. That one is dangerous, she warned when she fully recovered consciousness. That one doesn't want to share this space. They took a break. Emma drank water. Then, against her assistant's advice, she insisted on continuing. She contacted the crying woman, the one searching for her lost medal. The anguish was palpable. Emma sobbed, tears running down her face, describing how she had dropped something precious in the garden, something her mother had given her, something she needed to find before she could rest. Finally, she connected with the young woman searching for her baby's grave. This presence was the saddest of all. Through Emma, she described having been a servant at Villa Paula decades ago, having become pregnant, having given birth in secret, having lost the baby, having buried it somewhere on the grounds. Now she couldn't remember where. She wandered eternally, searching, never finding. When the session finally ended, it was past 10 at night. Everyone was exhausted, emotionally drained. Emma needed 15 minutes sitting in silence before she could rise from the chair. Cliff played back the recording. The tape was completely blank. Only static. 3 different recorders, all positioned in different places. All blank. It happens sometimes, Emma explained. When the energies are very strong, they interfere with electronic devices. They scheduled regular sessions. Emma came every 2 weeks during the following months. She developed a deeper relationship with the entities, especially with the presence everyone believed was Paula. In a memorable session in January 1976, something extraordinary happened. Emma, who in her normal life didn't know how to play the piano, rose from the table during a deep trance, went upstairs, entered the master bedroom where Cliff had placed an upright piano he had recently bought, and began to play. They weren't random notes. It was real music, executed with technique and feeling. Arias from Carmen, exactly the pieces Paula had loved. The witnesses were astonished. Cliff and 2 of his friends tried to record the moment with 3 different tape recorders. Emma played for almost 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly, blinked in confusion, and asked how she had gotten to the 2nd floor. When they checked the recordings, all the tapes were blank again. But everyone present had heard. They had been witnesses. No one who was at Villa Paula that night could deny what had happened. During a February session, the aggressive entity returned. This time, her message was clear and direct. Through Emma, she screamed with a voice that wasn't human, "I don't want cats in my house." The statement was so vehement, so charged with hatred, that Emma broke the trance immediately, coughing, her throat irritated as if she had been screaming for hours. Cliff remembered Spots, the tabby cat crushed by the gate. He remembered how his other 2 cats behaved with fear around certain areas of the house. Now he understood. One of the spirits, probably the aggressive woman in red, had a pathological aversion to cats. Weeks later, Cliff's 2nd cat disappeared. It simply vanished. There was no body, no signs of a fight or escape. The cat was in the house in the afternoon, and by morning it had disappeared. The 3rd cat died 2 weeks later. Cliff found it in the backyard, also crushed by the iron gate. Again on a windless day. Again with the gate that had been secured. Cliff didn't adopt more cats. The sessions continued until late 1976. Emma worked to calm the entities, especially the aggressive ones. She performed blessings. She placed protections. She spoke with each presence, explaining to them that Cliff wasn't a threat, that he only wanted to restore the mansion to its former glory, that they could coexist. Gradually, the phenomena began to diminish. Dishes stopped flying. The gate stopped closing by itself. The smells of coffee and roses became more subtle, almost comforting instead of overwhelming. The piano music was still heard occasionally, but now Cliff found it beautiful instead of unsettling. In April 1977, Emma performed a final séance. She declared that the energies at Villa Paula were balanced. The entities had accepted Cliff's presence. They had understood that he respected the house's history, that he wasn't a vandal or destroyer but a restorer, a guardian. "You can live here in peace now," Emma told Cliff. "They have accepted you." And for almost 2 years, Emma was right. Villa Paula became quiet. Cliff completed the restoration. The mansion looked spectacular, a neoclassical jewel shining in the middle of Little Haiti. He began receiving visitors, people interested in the architecture, historians, curious people who had heard the stories. The city of Miami officially designated Villa Paula as a historic structure in June 1983. It was recognition of its architectural and cultural importance. Cliff attended the ceremony proudly, feeling that all his effort had been worthwhile. But on the night of that same ceremony, while Cliff celebrated with champagne in the living room, he heard footsteps on the 2nd floor. High heels on wood. Click, click, click. The phenomena had returned. Cliff slowly climbed the stairs. The 2nd floor hallway was empty, but one of the doors, the master bedroom door, was ajar. He was sure he had left it closed. He approached and pushed the door gently. The room was bathed in moonlight. And there, sitting in front of the piano Cliff had placed against the wall, was a silhouette. It wasn't a diffuse shadow this time. It was a complete figure, semi-transparent but clearly defined. A woman in a long dress, hair pulled back in a bun, hands suspended over the piano keys as if she were about to play. She turned her head toward Cliff. For a moment their eyes met. There was sadness in those eyes, a deep and endless melancholy. Then she smiled. And she vanished. Cliff remained in the doorway, his heart pounding hard, but without fear this time. Only a deep and strange understanding. Villa Paula would never be completely his. It was and always would be Paula's house first. He was simply a guest. The phenomena continued in waves during the 80s. Sometimes they were intense, with objects moving and doors closing. Other times they were subtle, only the familiar smells of coffee and roses, the occasional piano music. In 1985, a postal worker named Larry Kozart purchased Villa Paula at auction for $110,000. When he learned about the house's reputation as haunted, he backed out immediately and canceled the deal. Cliff finally decided to sell. The restoration was complete. He had fulfilled his mission. And living with the spirits, although he had reached a certain peace with them, was exhausting. In 1987, he sold Villa Paula to Dr. Lucien Albert, a Haitian pediatrician skeptical of the supernatural. By the time Cliff moved out, he had lived at Villa Paula for 13 years. 13 years of inexplicable phenomena, of encounters with the impossible, of coexisting with presences that defied all logic. Decades later, living in North Carolina, his voice still firm over the phone, Cliff Ensor would tell journalists, "The house is definitely haunted. I experience things that have no explanation." Emma, the medium, used to channel spirits who played the piano like professionals, even though she couldn't play a single note. We recorded everything on 3 different tape recorders. The tapes always came out blank. He paused, remembering. After leaving Villa Paula, I lived in 5 more houses that also turned out to be haunted. The journalists caught the implication. Was Cliff Ensor a man who attracted paranormal phenomena, or was Villa Paula really haunted? The question remained unanswered. But the new residents of Villa Paula would soon discover their own truth. Dr. Lucien Albert didn't believe in ghosts. He had been born in Haiti, had studied medicine at universities where science and reason were the only truths that mattered. He had seen too much poverty, too much real suffering to worry about superstitions about spirits and haunted houses. When he purchased Villa Paula in 1987, he knew the stories. Real estate agents had been transparent, probably obligated by law to disclose the property's reputation. Cliff Ensor had been honest about his experiences. Neighbors whispered warnings. Lucien Albert listened politely and smiled condescendingly. "Old houses make noises," he said. "People see what they want to see." He converted Villa Paula into his pediatric clinic. He installed examination rooms in the former first-floor bedrooms. He placed a waiting room in what had been the elegant dining room where Paula Milord put her fresh roses. His personal office occupied the main living room. During the first months he reported nothing unusual. He saw patients during the day, returned to his home in Coral Gables at night. Villa Paula functioned perfectly as a medical clinic. Children played in the waiting room. Parents filled out forms. Everything was normal, professional, scientific. Then he began staying late. Accumulated medical histories required his attention. Paperwork, follow-up calls, treatment planning. Some nights he worked until 10 or 11, alone in the mansion after his staff had gone. It was during those solitary nights when he began to notice things. Small things at first. Files he swore he had left on his desk appeared elsewhere. Doors he had closed were open. Lights he remembered turning off were on when he returned from another room. Fatigue, he told himself. I'm working too many hours. But then he heard the footsteps. High heels walking on the second floor. Click, click, click. Distinctive, unmistakable. No one had access to the second floor except him. He had converted those rooms into storage for medical supplies. He went up to investigate. The hallway was empty. The rooms silent. The medical supplies exactly where he had left them. One October night in 1988, while reviewing x-rays in his office, he smelled coffee. Strong Cuban coffee, freshly made. The aroma filled the entire room, so intense that his stomach growled with hunger. But there was no coffee maker in the clinic. His staff didn't prepare coffee. And it was 10 at night. He was completely alone. He followed the smell to the old kitchen, now converted into a storage area for medications. The aroma was overwhelming there, as if someone had prepared a giant pot of coffee right in front of his nose. There was nothing. Only shelves with medicine bottles and supply boxes. Dr. Albert left the kitchen, locked the door, and decided it was time to go home. That was enough work for the night. In 1989, the Miami Herald published an article declaring Villa Paula Miami's most haunted house. The article revisited Cliff Ensor's experiences, interviewed Emma Tandrick about the seances, compiled testimonies from neighbors who claimed to have seen lights moving in second-floor windows when the clinic was closed. Dr. Albert read the article with irritation. It wasn't good for his business. Parents might worry about bringing their children to a haunted house. He considered suing the newspaper for defamation, but his lawyer advised him that ignoring it would probably be a better strategy. As long as you continue operating a successful clinic, his lawyer said, people will forget the nonsense about ghosts. But people didn't forget. In fact, the publicity attracted a different type of visitor. Paranormal investigators began appearing, requesting permission to conduct studies at Villa Paula. Dr. Albert rejected them all. Journalists called constantly. Curious people stopped in front of the mansion taking photographs, hoping to see something supernatural. It was annoying but manageable. Until Fernando Garcia arrived. Fernando was a Cuban fashion designer who needed a space to work. He had heard that Villa Paula had rooms on the second floor that Dr. Albert wasn't using. Fernando offered to pay rent to use those rooms as a studio during nights and weekends, when the clinic was closed. Dr. Albert accepted. Additional income without extra effort. Fernando seemed like a serious, professional person. He didn't mention anything about ghosts during negotiations. Fernando moved in during the early 2000s. He installed his work table in one of the old rooms, brought mannequins to design dresses, filled the spaces with fabrics and sewing machines. At first everything went well. Fernando worked mainly at night when inspiration came. He liked the quietness of Villa Paula after dark, the ample space, the high ceilings that made the rooms feel spacious and full of creative possibilities. Then the incidents began. One Tuesday night, Fernando was sitting at his desk, drawing designs for a new collection. He was completely concentrated, the pen moving quickly over the paper. He heard a crack behind him. Before he could turn his head, the window glass panel detached from its frame and fell to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Fernando jumped from his chair. The glass had fallen exactly where his chair had been moments before. If he hadn't gotten up at the sound, the glass would have fallen directly on him. He examined the window frame. There were no signs of deterioration. The glass had simply detached, as if someone had pushed it from outside. But he was on the second floor. There was nothing outside except air. He cleaned up the glass, boarded up the window, and decided it was probably just bad luck. Old construction. Things that happen. 2 weeks later, he was again at his desk when he heard a different crack. This time he looked up just in time to see a section of ceiling, a piece of plaster weighing at least 40 pounds, detach and fall. Fernando threw himself from the chair. The plaster crashed exactly where he had been sitting seconds before. The impact created a crater in the wooden floor. Fernando remained lying on the floor, breathing hard, looking at the piece of plaster that easily would have crushed his skull. If I hadn't moved when I did, I would be dead, he later told Dr. Albert. That night, Fernando began hearing the other sounds. Knocking on the wooden ramp that led to the back door. Thump, thump, thump. As if someone were climbing, step after step, approaching where Fernando worked. But when he opened the door, no one was there. The knocking continued for weeks. Always at night. Always the same pattern. Always stopping just before Fernando opened the door. One Friday night, Fernando brought his cat, a gray Persian that often accompanied him when he worked alone. The cat settled in a corner of the room, purring quietly. 2 hours later, the cat disappeared. Fernando searched throughout the entire second floor. He called the cat. He checked every room, every closet, every corner. The cat wasn't there. The doors were closed. The windows secured. There was no way the cat could have escaped. He never found it. Fernando began working only during the day. But even then he felt watched. There were presences at Villa Paula, he was certain now. Presences that didn't want him there. After 3 years renting the space, Fernando decided not to renew his contract. I don't believe in ghosts, he told a reporter years later. But strange things happen in that house. Things I can't explain. Dr. Albert continued operating his clinic until 2003, when he sold Villa Paula for $275,000 to Mark Swedroe, a real estate investor and son of renowned Miami Beach architect Robert Swedroe. In an interview, Mark Swedroe said he had never experienced anything paranormal at Villa Paula. The house is simply very peaceful, he stated, but Mark rarely spent time at the mansion. He had bought it as an investment with plans to restore it further and convert it into a cultural space. Legal problems with a business partner, Martin Siskind, delayed those plans for years. Meanwhile, Villa Paula began being used occasionally as an art gallery and event space. Artists rented the rooms for exhibitions. Couples celebrated weddings in the garden. Groups organized photo shoots taking advantage of the historic architecture. And everyone invariably reported strange experiences. A groundskeeper who lived briefly on the property to care for it reported that objects didn't stay where he left them. Tools he placed in one spot appeared in another. Light bulbs in a lamp began turning on and off randomly, all together as if someone were playing with the switch. But the switch didn't move. Joe Chirichigno, an artist who resided at Villa Paula for 6 months and then became the resident artist of the place, had more direct experiences. He reported hearing whispered conversations in Spanish when he was alone. He felt presences moving around him. Once, while painting on the second floor, he clearly felt someone touch his shoulder. He turned around. No one was there. In 2015, a paranormal investigation group called PRISM, Paranormal Research and Investigative Studies Miami, obtained permission to conduct a formal study at Villa Paula. They spent several nights in the mansion with recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, night vision cameras. The group's leader, David Pierce Rodriguez, documented numerous anomalies, unexplained temperature fluctuations, audio recordings with voices that hadn't been heard during the sessions, orbs of light captured in photographs. On one occasion, during a question session directed at the supposed spirits, the EMF detectors began registering significant energy spikes. The investigators asked questions in English and Spanish, and the devices seemed to respond, lights blinking in patterns that the investigators interpreted as affirmative or negative answers. Villa Paula is one of the most paranormally active places we've investigated in Miami, Rodriguez declared in an interview for a local television channel. There are multiple entities present, and some are more communicative than others. The news segment about PRISM's investigation renewed public interest in Villa Paula. The video went viral on social media. Thousands of people shared the story, adding their own theories and speculations. The mansion was put up for sale multiple times over the years. $3.5 million in 2016. $4.5 million in 2018. The figures varied, but the result was always the same. Interested buyers who visited the property heard the stories and decided to look elsewhere. It's a beautiful property, the director of commercial development for Sotheby's Realty told a journalist. It's received attention from potential buyers throughout the United States and Europe. They understand it's a unique piece of art and history in Miami. What he didn't mention was how many of those potential buyers disappeared after spending an hour at Villa Paula. After walking through the second-floor hallways where the air always seemed colder. After standing in the dining room where the aroma of roses appeared without reason. After seeing the sarcophagus in the backyard, covered with roots, guarding its secrets. In 2019, a Miami New Times journalist, Terrence Cantarella, published an exhaustive investigation debunking several legends about Villa Paula. He demonstrated that Paula Milord wasn't buried in the backyard, that she had died 2 years after moving out of the mansion, that obituaries placed her at Woodlawn Cemetery, although her grave was never found. The investigation was meticulous, based on public records, death certificates, historical documents. Cantarella even added an update years later reflecting that many of Cliff Ensor's claims were questionable, especially considering that Ensor had lived in 5 haunted houses after leaving Villa Paula. It was excellent journalism. Skeptical, well-researched, rational. But it didn't answer the question that mattered. If Paula wasn't buried at Villa Paula, if Cliff Ensor was potentially unreliable, if the legends were exaggerated or fabricated, then what explained the phenomena that continued being reported year after year, decade after decade, by dozens of different witnesses who didn't know each other? Why did cats keep disappearing or dying under strange circumstances? Why did the aroma of Cuban coffee keep appearing when no one was preparing coffee? Why was piano music heard from the second floor when there was no piano and the house was empty? Skeptics had their explanations. Collective suggestion. Desire to believe. Stories that fed themselves, creating expectations that people then experienced because they expected to experience them. Believers had theirs too. Villa Paula was haunted. Simple. 5 spirits resided there, just as Emma Tandrick had identified in 1975. And they would remain there, walking the hallways, playing the invisible piano, closing doors, protecting their home from intruders, until they finally found the peace they had been seeking for decades. The truth, as often happens with these cases, was probably somewhere between both extremes. Or perhaps beyond both, in territory that science hadn't yet learned to explore. What was undeniable was this: Villa Paula had a reputation. And that reputation, deserved or not, real or imagined, had become an inseparable part of its identity. It was Miami's most haunted house. and probably would remain so. In October 2025, almost exactly 50 years after Emma Tandrika's first seance, Villa Paula still stands at 5811 North Miami Avenue, in the heart of Little Haiti. The mansion has survived hurricanes that devastated other historic structures in Miami. It has withstood decades of abandonment, vandalism, and the radical transformation of the neighborhood around it. The houses surrounding it have changed, demolished, and rebuilt multiple times. Businesses have come and gone. But Villa Paula remains, its white stucco walls still shining under the Florida sun, the name Paula still visible above the main entrance, carved in marble almost a century ago. Recently, the design gallery The Future Perfect opened its fourth location at Villa Paula. The gallery features collectible furniture, works by designers like Anthony Gurry, Chris Wolson, and Jason Kaharick. The rooms that were once a Cuban consulate, private residence, pediatric clinic, and fashion design studio now display fantastical wicker chairs, artistic metal tables, bocce chandeliers hanging from those 18-foot ceilings. The Future Perfect representatives know the history. Over the decades, Villa Paula has served as a diplomatic hub, cultural salon, and according to local lore, one of Miami's most haunted residences, they declare in their promotional material. The word haunted appears with a knowing smile. Part marketing, part acknowledgement that some stories are too persistent to ignore completely. Gallery visitors walk through the rooms admiring contemporary design juxtaposed against historic architecture. Some know the legends. Others discover them when they ask about the building's history. And some, according to gallery employees and private conversations, experience things they can't easily explain. One visitor reported feeling pressure on his shoulder while climbing the stairs to the second floor, as if someone invisible was trying to stop him. Another swore he saw a shadow moving through the upper hallway, a form that disappeared when observed directly. An employee admitted she prefers not to stay alone in the gallery after dark. "It's not that I've seen anything specific," she explained. "It's just a feeling. Like you're being watched. Like you're not really alone even though all the rooms are empty." The Little Haiti neighbors, especially the Haitian residents who have lived in the area for decades, maintain a respectful but cautious relationship with Villa Paula. Many cross the street to avoid passing directly in front of the mansion. Not from fear exactly, but from respect toward whatever resides there. "There are spirits in that house," says a woman who has lived 2 houses down since 1980. "They're not necessarily evil, but they're there. Anyone who's lived here long enough knows it." The mystery of the sarcophagus in the backyard was never solved. The fig tree roots have wrapped it so completely that it would be necessary to destroy the tree to access the structure. And no one has been willing to do that, partly out of respect for history, partly from fear of what they might find. Is there something inside? The remains of a servant's baby from last century? An altar or shrine built by some devout owner? Simply an ornamental decoration that generations of residents have loaded with meaning it never had? No one knows, and probably no one ever will. Paula Milord died on August 25, 1932. That's a documented fact. Her obituary appeared in the New York Times and in the Key West Citizen. She died at Jackson Memorial Hospital from complications related to a leg amputation. She was 61 years old. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery on SW 8th Street in Miami. Cemetery records confirm her location. Grave number 1115, section 27. But the grave never had a headstone. There's no marker. Anyone visiting Woodlawn looking for Paula Milord's final resting place will find an unmarked stretch of grass. Domingo Milord died 5 years later, on November 23, 1937. He was buried at Key West Cemetery. Records confirm his presence there, but like with Paula, there's no headstone, no specific location number. A pauper's grave, though Domingo wasn't poor. It's as if both wanted to disappear after death, to quietly withdraw from history without leaving permanent physical traces. Except for the mansion. Villa Paula is their monument. More enduring than any headstone. More visible than any grave. The name carved above the entrance has survived almost 100 years and will probably survive 100 more. And if the stories are true, Paula herself remains there. Not in a sarcophagus in the backyard. Not in an unmarked grave at Woodlawn. But in the hallways where she once walked, in the bedroom where she closed the door against drafts while playing her piano, in the kitchen where she ground Colombian coffee every morning, in the dining room where she placed fresh roses even out of season. Cliff Ensor died sometime after 2008. Until the end, he maintained his story. The house was haunted. He had seen things. He had experienced phenomena that had no rational explanation. The fact that he also claimed to have lived in 5 other haunted houses after leaving Villa Paula raises questions. Was Cliff Ensor a man with special sensitivity toward the paranormal? Or was he someone who saw ghosts where others saw only shadows? Emma Tandrick, the medium who performed the seances and who supposedly channeled spirits that played piano with mastery she didn't possess, also died years ago. The audio tapes from those sessions, which always came out blank, never provided physical evidence. Only the witnesses' testimonies remained. And testimonies, no matter how sincere, are always subjective. Dr. Lucien Albert, the skeptic who operated his pediatric clinic at Villa Paula for years, never spoke publicly about paranormal experiences. Journalists tried to contact him multiple times for articles about the mansion. He never responded. Perhaps he had nothing to report. Perhaps he had things he preferred not to share. Fernando Garcia, the fashion designer who almost died twice in strange incidents, still lives in Miami. He occasionally talks about his time at Villa Paula, always with the same phrase, "I don't believe in ghosts, but strange things happen in that house." It's a perfect statement. It acknowledges the facts without committing to a supernatural explanation. It admits the mystery without resolving it. The Prism paranormal investigators continue studying supposedly haunted locations in Miami. Villa Paula remains on their list as one of the most active sites. They plan to return for more investigations when they obtain permission. Will they discover something definitive? Probably not. The history of paranormal investigation is full of intriguing but never conclusive results. Suggestive evidence but never probative. Extraordinary experiences but never replicable under controlled conditions. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Perhaps ambiguity is an essential part of stories like Villa Paula's. What we know with certainty is this. A mansion was built in 1926, designed with love by a Cuban consul for his opera singer wife. It was beautiful. It was a symbol of elegance and diplomacy. It was for a few brief years a happy home. Then came sadness, illness, death, abandonment, decades of deterioration. And then came Cliff Ensor, who rescued it from demolition, who invested his money and time in returning its glory, who lived with inexplicable phenomena for 13 years but refused to abandon his project. Dozens of people have passed through Villa Paula in the 50 years since Ensor began reporting paranormal activity. Some experienced strange things. Others didn't. Some believed. Others remained skeptical. But all, without exception, recognized that Villa Paula was special. Not just for its architecture or its history, but for something else. Something intangible. An atmosphere. A presence. A feeling that the walls of that mansion guarded secrets that would never be completely revealed. Today, as the sun sets over Little Haiti and shadows lengthen over Villa Paula's white facade, the mansion waits silently. The future-perfect lights turn on, illuminating the contemporary design exhibitions. Visitors enter, admire, leave. And perhaps, on the second floor, in a room that once housed a piano, a presence watches. Perhaps she smiles. Perhaps she waits patiently for everyone to leave so she can, once more, close the door against the drafts and play her favorite arias from Carmen, on an instrument only she can see. Or perhaps there's nothing. Perhaps it's just an old house with interesting history and exaggerated reputation. The answer, like so many things at Villa Paula, remains wrapped in mystery. And probably always will.